The year is 1565. 40,000 Ottoman soldiers, the most feared army on earth, are sailing toward a small, barren island in the center of the Mediterranean. Their mission is clear: crush the last Crusader stronghold standing between Islam and Christian Europe. On that island, Malta, just 500 knights of St. John wait behind crumbling walls. 500 men against 40,000. The outcome seems inevitable. And yet, what happened next would change the course of history forever. This is the story of the Great Siege of Malta, a story of faith, blood, and the kind of courage that defies all reason. To understand why this battle mattered, we need to go back. By the mid-16th century, the Ottoman Empire was at its peak, stretching from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia, from the Balkans to North Africa. It was the largest and most powerful empire on earth. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent ruled over millions, commanded armies that seemed endless, and possessed a navy that controlled the Mediterranean like a private lake. For decades, Christian Europe had been retreating. Constantinople, the jewel of the Byzantine Empire, had fallen in 1453. The Ottomans pushed into Hungary, besieged Vienna, and raided the coasts of Italy and Spain with impunity. Everywhere they went, the crescent banner flew and the church bells fell silent. But there was one thorn in the Sultan's side, one group of warriors who refused to bend. The Knights of St. John. These were no ordinary soldiers. They were warrior monks, men who had taken vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but who had also trained from boyhood in the brutal art of medieval warfare. Originally formed during the Crusades to protect Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land, the Knights had fought in every major battle between Cross and Crescent for 400 years. They had defended Jerusalem, held the walls of Acre, and waged war across the Mediterranean. But as Islam advanced, they were driven back. First from Jerusalem, then from Rhodes in 1522, after a siege that lasted 6 months. After Rhodes, the Knights wandered like exiles, unwanted and broken, until the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V offered them a new home, the island of Malta. Malta was not a prize. It was a rock, barren, sun-scorched, with little fresh water and almost no trees. But it had one priceless asset: its harbors. The Grand Harbor of Valletta was one of the finest natural ports in the Mediterranean, a perfect base for the Knights to continue their raids on Ottoman shipping. And raid they did. For 40 years, the Knights of Malta became the scourge of the Ottoman navy. They captured Muslim merchant ships, freed Christian slaves, and disrupted trade routes that fed the empire's war machine. Malta was not a prize. It was a rock, barren, sun-scorched, with little fresh water, but Suleiman had had enough. In 1565, at the age of 70, the Sultan ordered the largest invasion force ever assembled in the Mediterranean to set sail for Malta. His goal was not just victory, it was annihilation. He wanted the Knights erased from history. 40,000 men boarded the fleet. 15,000 of them were Janissaries, the elite infantry of the Ottoman army. These were not conscripts or peasants with pitchforks. Janissaries were taken as boys from Christian families, converted to Islam, and raised in military barracks, where they learned only one thing: how to kill. They were trained with the arquebus, an early firearm that could punch through armor at close range. They carried scimitars, daggers, and composite bows. They fought in disciplined ranks and were fanatically loyal to the Sultan. They did not retreat. They did not surrender. The fleet also carried thousands of Sipahi cavalry, engineers, sappers, and gunpowder experts. Most terrifying of all were the siege guns, massive bronze cannons, some weighing over 3 tons, capable of hurling stone balls the size of a man's torso. These guns could reduce fortress walls to rubble in days. Commanding this armada was Mustafa Pasha, a seasoned general in his 70s who had fought in some of the empire's greatest campaigns. At his side was Piale Pasha, admiral of the Ottoman fleet, and the infamous corsair Dragut, known as the Drawn Sword of Islam. Dragut was a legend in his own right, a pirate, a warrior, and a tactical genius who had terrorized Christian shipping for decades. He was 70 years old and still hungry for blood. On the 18th of May, the Ottoman fleet appeared on the horizon. Maltese fishermen saw it first. Hundreds of galleys, their oars beating the water in unison, banners of the crescent snapping in the wind. The sound came before the sight, the deep, rhythmic pounding of war drums, the chanting of soldiers calling on Allah. It must have felt like the end of the world. On the walls of Malta, Grand Master Jean Parisot de Valette stood and watched them come. He was 70 years old. His hair was white, his face carved by decades of war. He had fought at Rhodes. He had been captured by Barbary pirates and chained to an oar as a galley slave for a year before escaping. He spoke 6 languages, including Arabic and Turkish. He knew his enemy, and he knew the odds. Valette had 500 knights under his command. Alongside them were roughly 8,000 Maltese militia, local men, farmers, fishermen, and tradesmen with little military training. There were also a few hundred Spanish and Italian volunteers. In total, perhaps 9,000 defenders against 40,000 invaders. But Valette did not despair. He gathered his men and spoke to them plainly. He told them that help might come from Sicily, but it might not. He told them they could not expect mercy. This was not a war for territory. It was a war for survival. If Malta fell, Rome would be next. All of Christian Europe would be open to invasion. He told them they would likely die, but he also told them this, that a man of faith and courage does not yield, even when the whole world is against him. The men knelt. They prayed the rosary together, and then they went to their posts. The Ottomans did not land immediately. For 3 days they scouted the coastline, probing for weaknesses. Malta's defenses were centered on 3 positions. First, the city of Birgu, also called Vittoriosa, where Valette and the main body of knights were stationed. Second, the neighboring town of Sanglia, across a narrow inlet. And third, a small star-shaped fort at the tip of a peninsula guarding the entrance to the Grand Harbor. This fort was called St. Elmo. It had a garrison of just 150 men. Mustafa Pasha saw St. Elmo and made his first mistake. He thought it would fall in days. He ordered his engineers to set up siege lines and drag the great cannons into position. By late May, the bombardment began. The sound was unimaginable. Each cannon shot sent a shockwave through the ground. Stone balls weighing hundreds of pounds smashed into the walls of St. Elmo, sending chunks of limestone flying like shrapnel. The defenders inside crouched behind rubble, covering their ears, choking on dust. The guns fired day and night, but the knights did not break. Every morning, they climbed out of the ruins and repaired the walls by hand. They used anything they could find: stones, timber, sandbags, even the bodies of the dead. When the Ottomans charged, the knights met them at the breach. They fought with swords, pikes, halberds, and their own firearms. Arquebuses cracked from the ramparts. Crossbow bolts hissed through the air. The Ottomans sent wave after wave of janissaries up ladders and across makeshift bridges. Each time, they were driven back. The knights fought like demons. When their swords broke, they used daggers. When their daggers were lost, they used rocks. And when they had nothing left, they used their fists. Dragut himself arrived to oversee the siege. He positioned his own batteries and intensified the bombardment. But on the 18th of June, a cannonball fired from St. Elmo's walls struck a rocky outcrop near Dragut's position. Shards of stone exploded outward. One of them tore through Dragut's skull. He collapsed, blood pouring from his head. He would die a week later, one of the greatest warriors of the age killed by a lucky shot. But his death did not stop the siege. If anything, it made the Ottomans more determined. By late June, St. Elmo was a ruin. The walls were gone. The courtyard was a crater filled with corpses. The defenders were down to a few dozen men, starving, bleeding, half mad with exhaustion. On the 23rd of June, the Ottomans launched their final assault. Thousands of janissaries stormed what was left of the fort. The knights met them in the rubble. They fought to the last man. Every single defender of St. Elmo died that day. But they had held for 31 days. Mustafa had said it would take a week. Those 31 days cost the Ottomans over 8,000 men. 8,000 of the Sultan's finest soldiers dead for a single small fort, and the rest of Malta had used that time to prepare. When the Ottomans finally broke into St. Elmo, they found nothing but corpses and a wooden cross still standing in the center of the ruin. Mustafa was furious. He ordered the bodies of the knights to be mutilated, nailed to wooden crosses, and floated across the harbor to Birgu as a message. Valet's response was ice cold. He took every Ottoman prisoner in his custody, brought them to the walls, and beheaded them in full view of the enemy. Then he loaded their heads into cannons and fired them back across the water. This was not a polite war. Now Mustafa turned his full attention to Birgu and Senglea. The bombardment that had shattered St. Elmo was nothing compared to what came next. The great guns roared for weeks. Entire sections of wall collapsed. Buildings inside the city were reduced to rubble. Smoke and dust hung over Malta like a shroud. The heat of summer was unbearable. Men fought in full armor under the blazing Mediterranean sun. Wounds festered, water ran low, food ran out. The defenders boiled leather straps to make soup. They chewed on belts and saddles just to have something in their stomachs. Children and old men carried stones to rebuild the walls. Women melted down church bells to cast bullets. Everyone fought, everyone bled. On the 15th of July, the Ottomans launched a coordinated assault by land and sea. Thousands of troops stormed the walls of Senglea from the landward side, while the Ottoman navy rode into the harbor, aiming to attack from the water. But Valet had anticipated this. He had stretched a chain across the harbor mouth and positioned sharpshooters on the walls. As the Ottoman galleys pushed forward, Christian guns opened fire. Cannonballs tore through hulls. Arquebuses picked off rowers. The galleys collided with each other in the narrow harbor, turning the water into chaos. Meanwhile, on land, the defenders of Senglea fought with terrifying ferocity. Knights in full-plate armor stood shoulder to shoulder with Maltese peasants wielding makeshift spears. They poured boiling oil and flaming tar on the attackers below. They dropped massive stones from the walls, crushing men in groups. When the Ottomans planted ladders, the defenders pushed them back, sending climbers plummeting to their deaths. The fighting lasted for hours. By the end of the day, the harbor was choked with wreckage and bodies. The Ottomans withdrew, having lost thousands more men. But they kept coming. In early August, Mustafa ordered the construction of a massive siege tower. This was a wooden structure on wheels, tall enough to overlook the walls, with platforms for arquebusiers and a drawbridge that could drop directly onto the ramparts. It was a medieval monster, and it rolled toward Senglea like a moving fortress. The defenders watched it approach with dread. But on the night before the assault, a small group of knights launched a raid on the Ottoman camp. They crept through the darkness, slit the throats of sentries, and set fire to the siege tower. The flames spread quickly. The tower collapsed into ash. Mustafa's grand weapon was gone before it could be used. Still, the Ottomans pressed on. By late August, both sides were near collapse. The defenders were starving, exhausted, and dying of disease. There were perhaps 3,000 men left who could still fight. The Ottomans had lost over 20,000 but still had numbers on their side. Mustafa planned one final, overwhelming assault. He would throw everything he had at Birgu and Senglea simultaneously. It would be total war. But then, on the 7th of September, a sail appeared on the horizon. Then another, and another. A relief force had arrived from Sicily. It was not a massive army, only about 8,000 Spanish and Italian troops, but it was enough. Valet saw them and made his decision. He ordered every able-bodied man to prepare for a counterattack. On the 8th of September, the gates of Birgu and Senglea were thrown open. The defenders, half dead and covered in blood, charged out with a battle cry that echoed across the island. For God and St. John! The Ottomans, exhausted and demoralized, saw the Christian banners advancing and broke. What remained of the greatest army on earth turned and fled to their ships. They abandoned their camps, their guns, their wounded. They left everything behind and sailed away in chaos. The siege was over. Malta had held. 30,000 Ottomans lay dead on the rocks. The knights had lost half their number. Thousands of Maltese civilians were gone, but the island still stood, and the cross still flew. News of the victory spread across Europe like wildfire. Church bells rang from Rome to Paris to London. The Pope declared that Malta had been saved by the hand of God. Historians would later call it one of the most decisive battles in world history. The Ottomans never again seriously threatened to invade Western Europe. The tide had turned, and it had turned because 500 men refused to kneel. So what made them stand? It was not weapons, though they had good ones. It was not walls, though they fought from behind them. It was something else, something deeper. The Knights of St. John were bound by vows, not just to fight, but to die if necessary. They had trained their entire lives, not just in swordsmanship and tactics, but in obedience. Obedience to God, to their order, to their brothers. That obedience gave them a kind of freedom that most people will never understand. When you have already surrendered your will to something greater than yourself, fear loses its power. You stop worrying about survival and start focusing on purpose. That is what discipline does. It transforms you. And that is what made Malta possible. The knights did not wait until the battle to become strong. They were already strong. They prayed together every morning, not as a ritual, but as a way of life. They confessed their sins, took the sacraments, and lived in community. They did not fight as individuals. They fought as a body. And when one man fell, another took his place. That is the power of brotherhood. That is the power of faith shaped by form. And that is why they won. Not because they were better warriors, though they were. Not because they were braver, though they were. But because they had something worth dying for. And when you have something worth dying for, you become very hard to kill. The legacy of Malta echoes through history. The city that rose from the ruins of the siege was named Valletta, after the Grand Master who led the defense. It stands today as one of the most beautiful cities in Europe, a living monument to courage and faith. The Knights of St. John continued their mission for another 200 years, eventually becoming the modern-day sovereign military order of Malta, a humanitarian organization that still exists. But more than that, Malta reminds us of something we have forgotten. That strength is not just physical, it is moral, it is spiritual, it is the resolve to stand when everything tells you to run. It is the willingness to suffer for something greater than yourself. And it is the understanding that true freedom comes not from doing whatever you want, but from binding yourself to what is true. 500 men stood against 40,000, and they won. Not because they were superheroes, but because they were saints. And maybe that is the lesson. Maybe the world does not need more power. Maybe it just needs more men willing to stand.